started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Keeney, and on behalf of UCD Executive Development, I'd like to offer you a warm welcome this morning. I'm delighted to be joined here by my colleague, Dr. Gearóid Hardy, who's going to talk about adaptive change in a VUCA world with us this morning. I'm going to be back with you at the end of the webinar to discuss our diploma in organisational change and transformation for those of you who want to hear more about it. I'll also be putting your questions to Gearóid throughout the webinar and at the end, so please do either include them in the chat or the Q&A at the bottom, and I'll be sure to put them to him. All right, well, look, without further ado, I will hand you over to Gearóid. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Maria. So good morning, everybody, and you're all very welcome. So what I would like to do over the next 40-45 minutes is talk a little bit about this VUCA world that we live in, and talk about the concept of adaptive change and how we need to turn up in the context of this world and what it might look like. So the purpose, as I say, of the session is to discuss VUCA, which is a term that was coined by the American military after the Cold War, and it's come to describe the world that they see their leaders operating in, where they hadn't really understood it before. And they're using the four words volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous to describe this environment. And this has become more prevalent in the world that we live in the world that we work in, that we have moved into this context. So it's a background to what we want to talk about. And the challenge that we have is, if we're living with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, we have to take ownership of how we turn up. And we're going to have to adapt within that environment on an ongoing basis, working differently and leading differently to the way we have in the past. So what I want to do in the seminar, as we said in the outline, is to look at that shift of moving from being a problem solver, being that subject matter expert, to more planning, to aim to reduce the uncertainty in the world that we're living in, and more importantly, the uncertainty that the people that are following and looking to us are living in and moving in. Just a little bit of context of who I am. I'm an adjunct lecturer here at the Smurfit School, and I teach leadership and organizational behavior strategy across Ireland, the Middle East, Asia, and the US. I've run my own consulting business since 1996, and this is going to be relevant to our talk, because what I want to do is to take the experiences I have of working in different sectors, both around developing strategy, developing leaders, and executive coaching, and bring them into some real life examples of how we work. My area of research, my area of interest, is primarily taking tools and techniques that work in one sector and environment and applying it to another. So just three examples. After action reviews are a key part of military and uniformed organizations. And what I've done is worked with healthcare organizations, taking the principles of after action reviews and applying them within healthcare scenarios. My research has looked at taking Agile Scrum from the ICT world, the IT world, and applying it into healthcare, but building on that, developing it into both policing and into the pharma sectors. And then taking lean from manufacturing and applying that across into completely different sectors like financial services and professional services. I have a doctorate in professional practice, an MBA, I've studied leadership and computer science is my background. If we look at the relevance of the world we're in, if we look at some of the situations that different sectors are facing, what I wanted to do as a precursor to talking about how we adapt and how we work within that VUCA, I just wanted to mention a few sectors I'm working with. If you look at healthcare prior to COVID, but more importantly COVID, if we look at healthcare in the last 2 years, it's been a world where volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity have become the core of what we do. So we've learned a lot working through COVID and working through the healthcare challenges that can help us as leaders apply it into other sectors. A lot of work I'm doing within policing, it's very interesting in that if we go back to 9/11, the FBI, the function of the FBI in the US was, it was a reactive police agency. It dealt with crimes as they happened, and as a result of 9/11, it had to become a proactive policing agency. Irish policing is moving from reactive policing to proactive policing. The whole area of data analytics, the whole area of interdisciplinary approach to crime is revolutionizing how policing is happening. It's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and most definitely it's ambiguous. Manufacturing, let's look at manufacturing today, look at supply chain issues, look at distribution channel issues, look at all of the things that are happening as a result of the global society. It's a VUCA world. Engineering is a really interesting space. We talk about technology disruption, we talk about the pace of change. And I know when I started in the IT sector myself in the 1970s, somebody mentioned Moore's Law, which is still relevant today. And it was an observation at that point in time, and as I say, still relevant today. Intel will still refer to it, that the number of transistors in an integrated circuit will double every 2 years. So there's that exponential growth over time. So there's that challenge that the technology is changing so quickly. How can we develop and grow our business? How can we lead our business in that context? And then the whole area of my background is I would describe myself as a pracademic, and a lot of my colleagues within the Smurfit School on the exec ed side of things, our role is applying research to practical problems. Our role is formulating solutions for complex issues and creating professional practice within your field. For those of you who are watching today, I want to build on these areas that I've highlighted here. I want to talk about the challenges of VUCA. I want to talk about the expectations that the followers will have of you in VUCA. And I want to give you a model and a tool set on how to deal with that. Now we have about another 40 minutes or thereabouts to talk through this with you. We're going to take questions as we go along, and my colleague Maria, she said, will be collating them. So at different points in time, we might stop and just see if there's specific questions that you have on what we've discussed to that point. This model, one that I came across many years ago, describes a lot of the VUCA world. It describes a lot of the challenges that we're facing in the systems that we're part of. So whether we're part of a corporate organization, a public sector organization, we're seeing these drivers at play. And particularly if we look over the last 2 years, if we go back to middle of March 2020 and think about the challenge that, you know, globally we faced, but think the challenge nationally we faced when our Taoiseach said that, you know, within 48 hours, we were shutting down the world of work. And this describes the environment of where we need to look at organizational and individual performance, and we need to look at it in relation to the level of pressure that the system is putting on the organization. And Williams has captured it here very well. And what he's showing us in the center of the graph is that when we're in this sort of mid-level of a pressure on the system or on individuals, people are working in a comfort zone, but we're seeing that there is a level of productivity, and it does grow over time as pressure moves across that x-axis. And when we move beyond the comfort zone, we can see this growth is escalating, and we're moving into this stretch area where we're getting a lot more performance from the system. But there's a fine line between the yellow zone and the purple zone. And there's a fine line between where we're putting pressure on people in the system to stretch people beyond their comfort zone, where we can very simply and quickly fall into a strain and potentially into a crisis. So if you think about your own organization, think about yourself on a personal level, think about who you were or who your organization was, let's just say this time 2 years ago, January 2020, and think of then the pressure that was put on the organization as a result of the pandemic and all of the things that brought. Think about how you moved and how the organization moved out of its comfort zone into this stretch zone. And what we have to do is regulate that pressure so that we don't go into a strain. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit this morning about a model of adaptive leadership developed by Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky at the Kennedy School of Government. And their whole model is built around this premise of regulating the pressure on the system. And this pressure is one of those drivers to help us navigate the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity of what we have. But we have to be very careful that as we move too much pressure, we go into strain. If we don't catch that in time, we get into fatigue, we get into poor decision making, and potentially we can go into crisis, and that crisis can manifest itself in many ways. So we have seen a huge amount of change affected in the last 2 years. And our challenge now is to maintain that change while maintaining a new comfort zone for the reality of that system. So as I said, VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Okay, it describes a situation of constant, unpredictable change that is now becoming our norm in certain industries and area of business. When I became aware of VUCA, probably 15, 16 years ago, 20 years ago, it was probably more in context of healthcare. We had the financial crash in 2008, and VUCA has become the way of the world that we work in. So it's about thinking about constant, unpredictable change. So what it demands from us is that we have to move beyond traditional, outdated approaches to management and leadership and how we work on a day-to-day basis. And that's the purpose of our webinar today, is to look at some tools that can help us within that environment. So the system that we're operating in, the environment we're operating in, is creating this version of VUCA. Our challenge as leaders is to create an alternate VUCA. And the way we do that is it's about creating vision. It's about creating understanding. It's about creating clarity. And it's about creating agility for the people around us as well as for the system around us. So that's our opportunity as leaders, a vision, trying to create that end goal that we're all trying to achieve and move to, acknowledging and demonstrating an understanding and an empathy with the people who are in the system with us, clarity where we can, but most importantly, agility to how we approach this environment. So if we look at different national governments across the world and look at how they've dealt with the pandemic, we can see different levels of engagement on this alternate VUCA. We can see in our own context of where our government were creating a vision of what they were trying to achieve, and that constant communication of the end goal of where we're trying to get to. There was an acknowledgement of the impact on people, and there was an acknowledgement of the pressure on people. We wanted total clarity of a solution, but that clarity wasn't always available because there were so many unknowns. But we wanted clarity within the context that we could have. And we had to have agility in our approach. So the approach from a public health perspective in March of 2020 was very different to the approach in July of 2020, October 2020, into 2021. But what we've also seen is we've become change fatigued. We can see where the public attitude, where there was support for the government and it was very high, it dropped off. We got fatigued with the change, we got fatigued with the pressure. So at the business school, one of our roles is to create environments and develop tools and skills to help our leaders, help you as leaders to navigate through these change cycles. It's to help people get into that buy-in, and as they're falling off, is to re-energize and bring people back. And we can see, as I said, different levels of success of that in different countries at different points in time. But this is our challenge and this is our opportunity. We create this alternate VUCA. This image I came across many years ago, and I think it's a very powerful image to demonstrate leadership and what is leadership. I'm just going to ask you for a moment just to contemplate the image of what you see in front of you, and what does it trigger for you? What does it say to you leadership might be? I'll just say, give you 10, 20 seconds to have a look at it. Then I'll share with you what other people see and what it might represent. So if we look factually at the image, what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing an individual going from a window platform balcony on the right-hand side to an alternate on the left-hand side. We're seeing a group of people who are observing the process and the interaction and what's being done. And we can see one particular individual on the left-hand side who is looking to us as the audience. So we might ask, well, what's going on here? And some people will look at that and say, well, we're seeing somebody taking a leap of faith. We're seeing somebody who's leaving a safe environment where there's a railing and protection, going to a less safe environment where there isn't a railing or protection. If we're to ask what are the audience thinking and what are the audience wishing for the individual, It might depend on the type of audience. It might depend on the nationality of audience. But the two extremes of what people might be feeling would be, I hope he makes it. He's brave. He's a risk taker. The other might be, he's foolish. He's gone from somewhere that's safe to somewhere that's dangerous. He probably won't make it. And the very technical term, maybe he's a bit of a prat. And perhaps they don't want him to succeed. But for us, we really don't know what's happening because we don't have context, but we're forming perceptions. And leadership is about context. So we need to manage the narrative. Now, two possible narratives that this picture could be creating. First could be the individual lives in the apartment on the right-hand side, and he has or she has seen smoke in the corridor of their apartment block, and they've heard a crying baby in the second apartment. So what they're trying to do is get to that second space to save the baby. It could also be that they were in the apartment on the right-hand side and they shouldn't have been, and the owner has come back and they're trying to get away from it. But we're only going to form perceptions and views because we don't know what's happening. So leadership is about creating that vision. It's about creating that understanding. It's about telling people what we're doing and why we're doing it. Because if we don't, people will form those perceptions. So the model of adaptive leadership comes from, I mentioned earlier, two academics, pragmatemics in the Kennedy School of Government, Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky. The book that they've written is called Leadership on the Line, Staying Alive Through the Dangers of Leadership. It's a really, really powerful book. I've had the privilege of both studying with the guys in Harvard, but I've worked with them. I've had Marty here in Ireland in the Garda College working on some programs I've been involved in there. But there's a synopsis of their work called A Survival Guide for Leaders. It's a Harvard Business Review article, and it's available through the library, or I'm sure we can look at getting you a copy of it. But within their work, they have come up with two descriptors, two paragraphs that they use to describe leadership. And they're very different to what you would see on your typical leadership courses. So the first thing that Ron Heifetz says on his programs is, to lead is to live dangerously. It's romantic and it's exciting to think of leadership as all inspiration, decisive action, and rich rewards. But leading requires taking risks that can jeopardize your career and your personal life. And then he goes on to say, it requires putting yourself on the line. It requires disrupting the status quo, surfacing hidden conflict. And when people resist and push back, there's a strong temptation for you to play it safe. Those who choose to lead plunge in, they take the risks, and sometimes they get burnt. Now, I know when I saw this work first, and I'm going back probably 20 years ago, I thought this was very negative. It wasn't what I thought leadership was about. It wasn't that exciting, invigorating piece. But as I've engaged with this more, but more importantly, worked across multiple sectors and multiple geographies, this really is a reality of leadership. It is about taking risk. It's about taking risk for the greater good. And one of the points Ron Heifetz makes in his work, he says there's no irony in the fact that we have developed this program and run this program in the John F. Kennedy School of Government. We're running this for public service globally. But he says John F. Kennedy is an example of a leader who took chances. He's an example of a leader who disrupted the status quo. He surfaced hidden conflict. And who knows, but maybe we'll find out in our lifetime why he came to the end that he came to. But there's no coincidence, as somebody said. So our challenge is, taking this as being a reality, how do we protect ourselves and protect the system and still deliver that change? How do we take those chances that could have a pushback or a negative impact on us? And one of the things we have to think about is how we got to where we are. And I find across the sectors that I work with and across the geographies that the following graphic that I'm going to show you describes how most got to where we got to. I started my career as a computer scientist. I worked in technology for over 20 years. I started as a doer, doing things. I graduated to being an expert within my field. Then there was an expectation that I become a manager within my field. And then there was an expectation that I become a leader within that field. And the challenge we have is that we have two very, very different paradigms here that we work in. Below the line, we have the doer and the expert. Above the line, we have the manager and we have the leader. So the challenge I want you to think about now and later on today for you and the role you're in, what percentage of your time do you spend as a doer? What percentage of your time do you spend in the expert role? What percentage of your time do you spend in the manager role? And what percentage of time do you spend in the leader role? They're all very different roles. And I would suggest that we will find, typically speaking, this is what the evidence has shown me, that people will spend 30 to 40% of their time typically above that line, which implies 60 to 70% of time below that line in the expert and doer role. So you might ask the question, why? Surely it should be the inverse and we're spending 60 to 70% of our time managing and leading. There are lots of reasons, there's lots of reasons why we're below that line. Some of them is the system pushes us there because we don't have the resource. Some of the reasons we're there is it's easier to fix it than to get others to fix it. Some of the reasons we're there is because people want us to be there. They want us as the problem solver. They want us in there fixing as opposed to facilitating and supporting. So I want to build on this premise and show you a model that shows the importance and value being the key word of our leadership journey of being above that line. An assumption we might have made when we're looking at the time we spend in those four spaces is our assumption, our differentiator as to what management means and what leadership means. The quote that works best for me is from Peter Drucker, and he would suggest that management is doing things right, where leadership is doing the right things. So my reflective point I want you to think about at this point is, where are you spending your time and where should you be spending your time? And when we look at the gap between where I am and where I should be, what are the drivers for that? And one set of those drivers is potentially going to be explained in a few minutes when we start to talk about adaptive change and technical change and what that might mean and what that might look like. So some organizations and examples of where I'm working with people who have come through that ladder. I have a manufacturing engineer who is the chief operating officer of one of the largest ventilator manufacturers in the world. His biggest problem during COVID was that he had a $2.5 billion back order list. How does he transition from being the engineer to being that chief operating officer? I'm working with a surgeon who's running a national service across a hospital group where his comfort zone is below that red line, specializing in the theater. I'm working with a police officer who's now an assistant secretary general within the UN. How has she transitioned from being a police officer on the beat to running a leadership role like that? I'm working with a stockbroker who's head of innovation and wealth management. I'm working with a religious minister who runs a religious organization of $20 million. An investment analyst who is now the chief operating officer of 2 airlines. An academic who is now frontline in national defense from COVID. A tax expert who's the chief operating officer for a professional services firm. A nurse who's the CEO of a hospital group. A naval pilot who's now head of global sales and marketing for defense and space security. These are all individuals who came up those ladders that we talked about earlier, and they have had to transition above that red line. That's our challenge of leadership, but most importantly in a VUCA world, this is where we have to get to. We can't stay in the comfort zone of manufacturing, ministry, investment, academia, or whatever it might be. We have to go across that line. So we want to give you some tools in the next half an hour to help you transition above that line. So Leadership on the Line, The Dangers of Leadership, Heifetz and Linsky, they've developed a model of adaptive leadership. And they talk about the challenges that we face as falling into 2 categories, adaptive challenges and technical challenges. The other thing they talk about is the word leadership and the word change are very similar, if not interchangeable. So let's keep those in mind as we look at this first example. So in their work, they talk about a technical problem. And a technical problem is a problem we face where the problem definition is clear. We totally understand the problem and we can define it. The solution definition is clear. We can clearly define the solution for the problem. The task at hand is applying know-how. The agent of change is an authority figure. And the key words to describe what we're doing here is well-known procedures. So an example, Heifetz is a clinician by background, although he never practiced. And he would talk about somebody arriving at the emergency room, the ED department, ED, with a heart attack. That would be classified as a technical problem for the medics in emergency medicine. They've clarity as to what the problem is, what the definition of the problem is, what the issue is. They've clarity around the solution. The job at hand is applying known processes and procedures to that problem. The agent of change is the authority figure, the subject matter expert, the consultant in emergency medicine, and they follow well-known processes and procedures. But we also have what we call adaptive problems. An adaptive problem is a problem where we don't understand the issue. We don't have clarity of the issue. We have a sense of the issue. We have some triggers around the issue. We have some symptoms of the issue. So by default, we can't have a solution. So understanding the problem will require learning. Understanding the solution will require learning. The task at hand now is something completely different to what we've done before. It's learning something brand new. The agents of change need to be the people at the core, i.e. the people with the problem. And key words to describe what's going on here is it's experimental and it's unknown. Now, if we stay with Heifetz's example of the person arriving at ED with a heart attack, once they've been stabilized, they're transitioned to the coronary care unit. And now that patient has what we call an adaptive problem, because for that individual, they don't know how to deal with the problem because the problem is unique to them. So, there's over 50 of us on the call at the moment. 50 of us could be in the coronary care unit with 50 completely different manifestations of the outcome of having a heart attack. So as an individual, we require learning. The solution will be unique for us. What works for me mightn't work for you. That's going to require learning. So the whole process is a cyclical, recursive learning process. But the people who are best suited to resolve the problem are the people with the problem, i.e. the patient. What works for you, what isn't working for you, and it's about that experimentation. So the key word here, as opposed to well-known process, it's about an experiential unknown process. Medicine is moving very fast from technical solutions to adaptive solutions, which is causing huge resistance. As patients, what we want from our clinicians is technical answers. On a personal level, last year I got COVID. I got most of the symptoms you can get from it. Well, one of the frustrations for me was that talking to a GP, talking to a doctor, talking to different people, no one could give me the answer as to what would fix me. Every different symptom I had, they couldn't say, take this and it will get rid of the symptom. It depended. It might work for me, it mightn't work for me. Drugs that work for somebody else mightn't work for me. Drugs that work for me won't for somebody else. But take that to yourselves. When we're sick, we want a technical answer. We want to go to the doctor. We want them to say it's A, B, C, and D. We'll do 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you're fine. But medicine isn't like that. Medicine is an adaptive problem. Each person who turns up ill, it's unique to them. And that's a challenge that we have. The agent of change for a technical problem is the expert, the person below the line. That person's role in adaptive work is to facilitate the people with the adaptive problem. We take this now back to COVID. I know for me personally, as a citizen of this country, I wanted technical solutions to COVID. I wanted the government, I wanted NEFID, I wanted the agencies of the state to say we will do A, B, C, and D and we'll come through this. I wanted them to give me certainty of what we would do and what we'd get there, but that wasn't possible because COVID is, and more importantly at that point in time, most definitely was an adaptive problem. We didn't understand the full problem. We didn't understand the solution. We had to go through a learning cycle, constantly going through this cycle until we started to find solutions, but we're constantly going through it. The role of leadership in an adaptive role like this is to facilitate the process, but it's to let the people with the problem, the people closest to the problem, to work that problem. Now, if we go back to the ladder, and look at the red line, and we had doer and expert below the line, we had manager and leader above the line. Doctors didn't become doctors to become managers. Engineers didn't become engineers to become managers. Our comfort zone as an engineer, a doctor, a financial expert, whatever, is below that line in our expertise. It's a comfort zone. It's why we got into the industry we got into. But in this VUCA world, we need to get beyond that, and we need to create the environment to manage that environment, because we are not always going to be able to fix it. It's going to be the people around us who fix it. So we have a problem here defined on the screen, and it's a problem some of you may face in life. You may have faced it already with somebody else in your life. I know I have faced it at a point in time, but we have an elderly relative who is driving and they probably shouldn't be. It's probably time that they have stopped driving and that they have given up their car, whatever it might be. And the question I would put to people is, what should we do? How should we deal with this situation? How should we engage with that relative? And when I work with audiences, we get lots of different answers to this, but some of the answers we might get would be, we'll talk to the local guard, local policeman, and we'll get him or her to go and have a chat and say, maybe you shouldn't be driving. We'll talk to the general practitioner and maybe encourage them not to sign off on the medical form, or to tell the person they probably shouldn't be driving. One person said to me, with air quotes, they said, imagine the car got stolen. Somebody else said, well, if you remove the distributor cap, the car won't work. All of those problems are technical solutions to a more bigger problem. The problem we have here is an adaptive problem. The person who's driving needs to come to a place where they acknowledge and understand and make the decision for themselves that they probably shouldn't be driving. So as a son, as a brother, as a whatever role, relationship you might have with the person, your role isn't to fix it with a technical solution, i.e. the police officer, the medic, the car gets stolen. Your job is to facilitate the other person's thinking in coming to a realization that they probably shouldn't be driving. It's helping that other person come to that life change and make that adaptation. But we have a major issue with this and a problem with this, because adaptive change is about loss. The person who had the heart attack is going to have to change their lifestyle completely. If we encourage our elderly relative to relinquish the car, relinquish their driving license, there are lots of things that are lost for them. So some of the losses that adaptive work will bring, it might be loss of identity. Think about the person who's been driving since they were 17. Now all of a sudden, that piece where they were one of the last of their peer group driving, they're no longer driving. You're losing a competence. I know myself, I have my driving license since I was 17. It was a big achievement for me. Giving that up, losing that would be difficult. It's a comfort zone. It's a security in yourself. It's your reputation. He's lost his driving license. It might be time, it might be resource. For some change, for some adaptive change, it could be life-threatening. Self-reliance, self-independence is gone, and for some people a job could be gone. So the challenge we have is that adaptive change, but most change brings loss. And all the research will show us that people don't resist change per se, but they will resist the loss that they perceive the change will bring to them. So again, this is a clue for us as leaders. We need to find ways to surface these issues, have the conversations about the perceived loss that the change will bring, and then help the individual put mitigants in place. If we put mitigants in place for the individual, then we own that problem. Our role is to facilitate the other person in coming up with those mitigants. So adaptive work, if you remember, we don't understand the fundamental problem. We don't understand the fundamental solution. It's about creating a space of learning. And creating that space of learning is where the individual will come to the solution. So that leads me to another quote. This was Marty Linsky in 2008 on a program we were working on. And he said to a group of people, he said, exercising leadership is a function of repeating familiarity, stability, and consistency. And when he asked the group what they thought of that definition, there was a very mixed feedback in the room. Some people thought, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And others said, absolutely not. I don't see anything here about vision. I don't see anything here about exciting. I don't see anything here about new. And Marty went on to explain, which is very important in this adaptive world. And I want you to think about the adaptive challenge of COVID and how it has impacted us. What he went on to highlight is that as followers, our perception of leadership is that it's a function of repeating what we've done before, of familiarity, of stability, and of consistency. So what did we want from Leo Varadkar and the Irish government in March of 2020? We wanted things to stay the way they were. We wanted cushy, as Del Boy would say. We didn't want anything else. However, as leaders, and this is the challenge that we face, as leaders, the system that we're part of, a perception is that it's about change, and change entails a number of things. We need to learn new things. We need to learn how to present university courses on Zoom. We need to learn how to run our business on Zoom. We need to be able to live through the uncertainty while we're learning these new capabilities. And potentially, potentially the loss of obsolete knowledge. Things we used to do before are no longer there. So this is a conundrum that we have. As followers, we have an expectation of leadership on the left-hand side. The system and the role of leaders is an expectation on the right-hand side. So there's a disconnect. And that's our challenge. How we bring people from expecting stability and consistency to a place of uncertainty and learning new things. And the more we go through the pace of change, the more people become comfortable with that right-hand side. So followers, and think about, again, I'm thinking about myself and COVID, we don't like the uncertainty of what's to come. We don't like the sensation of loss due to our old ways. I get my energy from people. For me, it was very difficult last April, May of 2020 to think about talking to a screen every day rather than being in a room with 30 or 40 people. There was the unknown things we had to learn. And then, in the broader picture, there is a sense of disloyalty to people and culture that change might bring. We've always done things in a certain way, the way we did things previously. Now, all of a sudden, we're in a situation where we're saying that wasn't valid. So change brings all of these things. So our role is not to let the system and people drag us down into creating solutions. Our role is to stay above that red line and create the space for the people around us to create those solutions for themselves. So what can we do and how can we do it? I'm aware there's a few questions in the chat, but we might just do is go for about another 10 minutes and then we'll talk to those questions and then we'll hand back to Maria. So what can we do in this space? What are the tools we can use? Well, one of the really important ones for me, and it's become part of my mantra or credo, is we need to be able to work both on the dance floor and on the balcony. We need to be able to get out of the dance. And when you think about a dance, if we're at a dance, a disco, whatever it might be, hopefully at the end of this month or next month, we'll be back in nightclubs or whatever. But when you're in a dance, you see what's going on immediately around you. You're aware of the people that are around you in that context, and you have a sense of a greater peace, and you have a sense of other things going on around you. But when we're on the balcony looking down at the dance and looking at the interaction on the dance, we're seeing the bigger picture. We're seeing outliers. We're seeing great dancers and not so good dancers. We're seeing people who are holding up the wall who aren't dancing. We're preempting things before they'll happen. We're seeing individuals maybe who've had too much to drink and they're probably going to be removed. We see somebody perhaps who's going to engage with somebody and hasn't read the body language and is going to make a bit of an idiot of themselves. We see groups on that dance floor. And Heifetz, when he talks about groups, he talks about them as cliques or as factions. The implication being that those groups have purpose. They perhaps have their own purpose. They have their own agenda, and that's driving their behavior. There's an exclusivity of what's going on. So we need to learn to alternate between being in the fray, being in the middle of what's happening, and getting up on the balcony to get that broader picture. Because from the balcony, what we see, the circle here is representing the broader picture of the people we're working with. But when we're up on the balcony, we can see that those individuals belong to subgroups or factions or cliques, and we need to understand what's happening there. In our VUCA world that we live in, we've moved more into interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary type of environments. We have multiple disciplines working at the same time. But if we look at this system here, the triangles are part of the triangle faction. The squares are part of the squares faction. So how are those external factions having an impact on the piece of work that we're doing? So that's why we need to understand the politics of what's happening around us, and the balcony helps us do that. However, there's a couple of things we need to think about. While we're saying it's about getting those two perspectives and those two views, if we spend, while we're on the balcony, should I say, we see the patterns of what's happening, we get the insights of what's happening, we see connections around what's happening, we get to reevaluate our assumptions of what's happening because we're looking at it from that higher, broader picture. But if we're up there too long and stay disconnected from the dance, we become disengaged, we potentially become checked out, non-relevant. Others might feel we're manipulating them because we're only staying outside of what's happening. Let's go back then to being on the dance floor. If we're on the dance floor, we're engaged, we're building our credibility, leading by example, you hear people say, we understand the work, we feel what others feel. But if we spend too long down there, we lose sight of that bigger picture, we lose sight of the task at hand, and we become exhausted because we're too included in the fray. So while it's easy to say, alternate between the balcony and the dance floor, we need to get that balance right. And we need to be very careful that people will be dragging us onto the dance because they want us in the middle of it. But if we're staying down there, we lose the value of where the balcony can bring us. So that's the challenge of VUCA. People, followers want stability. They want us down in the middle of what's happening, but we really need to be on that balcony. We need to be leading. We need to be seeing that broader picture and engaging at that different level. So to protect ourselves within this, because people will try and blame the leader. An example of my own recent, I was involved in a conflict resolution in a highly volatile environment with highly skilled specialists. And when they weren't happy that they weren't getting a technical solution, that I was forcing them to resolve the conflict, what they did was they tried to take me out to distract from the issue of what they were doing. So what Heifetz and Linsky would say, for me, what I needed to do and what I was doing within this was A, manage my environment, and B, manage myself. Managing the environment was protecting myself from the threats that people were trying to remove me and remove my position. And on managing self, it's about reducing that, what we'll call self-destruction, that piece of where we're letting ourselves down. So just going back and looking to what Heifetz and Linsky are talking about, it is exciting, it's even glamorous to lead others through these difficult times, but it also has a dark side. The attempts to take you out of the game when you're steering the organization through difficult change because you're bringing people where they don't want to be. Leading change requires asking people to confront painful issues and to give up habits and beliefs that they hold dear. You're telling them that the habits that they have, the beliefs they have are no longer valid. People will try and take you out rather than do that. And whether they attack you personally or undermine your authority or seduce you into seeing things their way, their goal is the same thing. They want you to lose focus. They want to derail you from your purpose. They want to ease their pain, and they want to restore familiar order. So we need to constantly be aware of people trying to remove us from the system. So in my example, people were going to the commissioning agent and talking about the nature of my interaction, and they were trying to focus the negativity on me rather than on the problem we're trying to resolve. And then what we have to do is manage the hostile environment. And that's about managing the organization, and it's about managing the people, but it's also about managing your own vulnerabilities. So I'm going to finish on this slide, and then I'm going to go back to my colleague Maria, who has a few questions for us. So 4 last things that we can do. So we talked about the balcony, we talked about the dance floor, we talked about protecting ourselves. We need to operate in and above the fray. And what we're saying here is we need to observe what's happening as it's happening. We need to move back and forth between the dance floor. And we really need to be asking the question, what's really going on here? And one of the sub-questions of that is, who's defending old habits and why? What is the resistance to change and what's causing it? Number 2 is we need to court the uncommitted. So the uncommitted are wary, but they are crucial to our success. we need to show them that our intentions are serious. So for example, certain people might have to be, in private sector, it might be dismissing individuals. In a public sector organization, it might be moving them out of sight, out of line of where we are, into a different place or a different environment, because it is necessary to make the change happen. And we need to walk the walk and talk the talk. We saw the model earlier from Harris of the relationship between pressure and performance. This is where we need to cook the conflict. We need to keep the heat high enough to motivate people, but low enough to prevent explosions. We need to raise the temperature to make people confront those hidden issues and those other tougher issues. Then we need to lower it to reduce turmoil. And we need to slowly move through the pace of change. And sometimes humor, breaks, and imagine a brighter future are simple tools that can help bring people along. But we need to regulate that stress. And the last piece there is we need to place the work where it belongs. So this is about resisting the temptation within me, the conflict within me to fix it. But because if you do fix it, people will blame you as being the person as the instigator. What we need to do is mobilize others to solve that problem. Sorry, there's one more slide. Last slide here. How do I manage myself? So that desire to control and need for importance. So it's important that we, for our own sake in the organization, that we don't do that. It's important that we stay above that red line. It's important that we don't have an inflated view of who we are. We have a more servant leadership approach where we lead from the back. And the last thing is we need to anchor ourselves. We need to find a safe space. The guys talk about the kitchen, the friend's kitchen table. Who are your confidants? Who are the people you can be open and true and honest with, who can give you true and real feedback? It's get a routine. It might be a daily walk. It might be listening to jazz music. It might be whatever, but it's something to help you recalibrate your moral compass and who you are. I mentioned confidant earlier. We need to be able to differentiate between a confidant and an ally. An ally will be aligned to us because it suits their need, but that could change. A confidant is a person who supports you and is there for you. You need confidence. And the very last thing here is that we need to be able to see when an attack is coming, that it's on the role that you're fulfilling rather than you as the individual. It's on the role of the leader. It's on the role of the CEO rather than John Smith or Mary Smith. And that will help you depersonalize and step outside of that issue and whatever that might be. So Maria, I'm going to hand back to you. I think we might have a few questions, and I know you want to talk to the group in a few minutes as well. So did we have some questions there?
That's right. Yeah, thanks so much, Gearóid. It was a really insightful, engaging webinar. I think it's really useful for leaders to be able to take a step back from the day-to-day and understand what their role is, and some really useful examples at the end of what they specifically can do in a practical manner. There's quite a few questions here, so I've just picked out a selection of them. This person actually is anonymous, but it's like, when time, energy, resources are limited, what is the downside of trying to apply a technical solution to an adaptive problem?
Okay, it's a great question, and it's the temptation we all have. Adaptive work takes time. The problem is, if we apply a technical solution, all that we're doing is dealing with a symptom. So if there's a hole in the dam, a technical solution is sticking a finger in the hole. It's stopping the water now, but it's not fixing the fundamental problem. One last example, if you have problems with the clutch in your car, you have a manual car, the issue could be a faulty clutch, or it could be the way you're driving. The technical solution is put in a new clutch, but the problem will come back again. So a technical fix is short term, but it doesn't fix the fundamental problem.
Okay, great. And this is an interesting one, because I know you teach on this topic on the Diploma in Organisational Change, but Patrick is asking, did you teach this topic before COVID, and did the concept stand up in COVID? Okay, it's a great question. So, and it's funny, Patrick, I'm aware I use COVID a lot, but I just felt it was relevant for our current reality. Yeah, I've been working with this model. You saw in 2008, we had Marty down in the Garda College for the Garda Executive Leadership Program that we ran through Smurfit. So I've been teaching this since that time. COVID has definitely shown it in a national level. And what I found in my work, it has helped people understand
the things that they're doing. So a lot of people wanted technical solutions in their organizations at COVID times, but that wasn't going to work. And the other thing was the virtual working and working from home. Where it's worked best is where people have had to work through the pain with support rather than people giving them a protocol. So it definitely, this model has helped people navigate COVID, most definitely.
Okay, great. And you mentioned that you work with the corporate sector and the public sector. I know indeed you teach on our on Garda Síochána from the police leadership program, and also with the Matter program on healthcare. So have you noticed a difference between adaptive leadership between the public and corporate sector?
I have, and it's a really good question, and there's no straight answer to it. The challenge we have is adaptive work brings conflict, adaptive work brings frustration, adaptive work brings resistance. There are less tools available in the public service that there are in the private service, because in a lot of roles in public service, people have tenure. There are very strong regulatory is probably the wrong word, unions, work practices, standards within the public service that are harder to affect change. It doesn't mean you can't, they're harder to affect change. Where in the private sector, there are more tools available, but it's down to resilience. So I'll give one very, very quick example. In Garda Síochána, piece of work I was involved in a number of years ago, they wanted to decentralize a function. They brought all the superintendents into Farm Leo was up in the Phoenix Park and said, right, we're decentralizing this function. Literally, they sat in the room like this. And they said, well, you're the authority, you're the commissioners, you're the assistant commissioner, you have the power, tell us how to fix it. And it was really, I was in this man's ear for a week, and at the time, the assistant commissioner, and he said, I don't know, I don't have the answer, you're the experts. But I'll come back to you this afternoon, have a think about it. And when they came back in the afternoon, they hadn't resolved it, but they were back, it's your job to fix it. It took him a week. And he was raising the heat and putting the pressure back, and they came up with a solution. But the most important thing about it was they owned the solution because it was their solution. But that took time, and that was back to the technical versus the adaptive. So definitely it is not for the faint-hearted, and it's why we say it's dangerous, because people will want to go after that assistant commissioner rather than face the reality.
Great, thank you. And this is a specific question about the healthcare system. Susan is asking, have you found that COVID has in some ways been a positive change in that it's accelerated improvements and efficiencies within the HSE?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. And I would say it has accelerated improvements. It has brought change within the HSE, but also private healthcare. Absolutely, 110%. The problem we have is that people are beginning to revert. The pressure from that pressure curve is now off, and people want to go back to the old ways. So the challenge of leadership is, how do we embed those changes and keep those changes? So it's constant, and it's a constant cycle. So we have, and the one sentence I leave on that is that what adaptive work helps us understand is painful, but it helps us understand the difference between things that we hold precious from things that are important. So a lot of times we can't affect change because we think something's important, but it's not, it's precious to us. And what has happened in healthcare is that we've realized a lot of things are precious rather than important. So an example is there's an awful lot of virtual clinics happening now where you have a video call rather than going to a hospital. We talked about that for 20 years. The pressure brought it on, and hopefully we'll keep that, but some people will revert.
Great. Just one final question then.
Yeah.
It's from Mark, and he's just wondering, he's saying that it's difficult to have this adaptive leadership style and stay on the balcony when you're working remotely from your teams.
That is one of the challenges, absolutely. And the problem a lot of companies have had is that they're trying to work virtually with their teams as they work physically, and that doesn't work. There's a completely different set of dilemmas in virtual working, and it's the perfect example of adaptive work. We need the team to come up with how we work. Agile teams have always worked disparately, have worked virtually, and agile teams come up with their own set of ways of working. There's a core set of boundaries, but then we agree how we will work within that. And that will be the piece that we need to bring into that adaptive work.
Great. Thanks so much, Gearóid. If you wouldn't mind sharing the slides.
Yeah, I'll put it back on.
And I'll talk about the Diploma in Organisational Change. I hope you enjoyed that webinar today as much as I did. And it's also hopefully given you an insight into our Diploma in Organisational Change and Transformation, on which Gearóid teaches one of the modules. And he covers adaptive change in a VUCA world. Hopefully you can see there. So just really to give you some practical information around the organizational change and transformation module. Gearóid, if you can just move on the slide there, that'd be great. Let's see. Brilliant, thank you. So really, I'm just giving you like a brief overview of the diploma, but what we will be doing is my colleague Leah will be sending you an email after the webinar with full details of the diploma that's coming up. So as you can see there, it's a level 9 qualification, a professional diploma in organizational change transformation. It's 6 2-day modules over 9 months. So usually you're in for a Friday and Saturday, and then you have 6 weeks in between each module. In front at the start of before the module, you'll be given some pre-reading, and you're expected to come to class prepared. And then after the module, you will be given an assignment. It's starting on the 7th of April, and you'll see that the class size is 30. We limit our class sizes to 30 because all our programs are very experiential. And indeed, many of our participants say they learn as much from their peers in the classroom as they do from the lecturers. So it's a very interactive approach. Also, just to say, the Diploma in Organisational Change and Transformation is also part of our MSc in Business, Leadership and Management Practice. So that's where you do 3 of our modules from a choice of 8, and you will gain your MSc qualification. You'll see there the fees as well are listed, 7,945, and also we offer a UCD business alumni rate for those who are UCD business alumni. So you'll see there that I have the full list on the screen there of the options of other diplomas that we offer. So there's 8 altogether. As I say, you choose 3 and you'll get your MSc. We also do a lot of custom programs for organizations. You'll see that Gearóid mentioned some of them throughout his webinar and ones that he teaches us on. So we offer accredited or non-accredited programs for organization, and they can be in person or online. So whichever suits your organization. And actually, in particular, this topic, as you can imagine, organizational change and transformation has become increasingly popular for organizations at the moment. Okay, great, thanks. And also just to remind you, our virtual open week continues this week, and we have Purpose and Executive Presence with Stephen Boyle tomorrow at 10 a.m. and that will be followed on Thursday with the Social Life of Strategy with Professor Patrick Gibbons. And finally, on Friday, we have Emotional Intelligence and Leadership with Helen Brophy. Okay. Last thing to mention is that we are back on campus for face-to-face teaching for all our diplomas. So that's a picture of our lovely campus in Blackrock. So we're delighted to have all our participants back on campus. And as I say, all the spring programs, including the Diploma in Organisation Change, will be in-person teaching. We do offer some online short courses, so if you're interested in any of them, please do get in touch. So I will leave it there for this morning. I'm conscious that we're on time now, and I'm sure you all have work to get back to. But look, we really appreciate your time this morning in joining us, and also thank you so much to my colleague, Dr. Gearóid Hardy, for giving his time this morning. Thank you all. Goodbye.